Sure, I can go first. Um, my name is Mithil, and Neil and I both are currently seniors at Basis Independent Silicon Valley. We've been both doing DECA for this will be our fourth year now, and we've done events together. We've done events separately. And Neil, you want to introduce yourself too?
Yeah, I'm Neil, as Mithil said. I'm a senior at Basis. I've been doing DECA for 4 years. I've basically done every event under the sun. But yeah,
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us today for this episode of Champ Camp. And as we mentioned earlier, today is going to be focused a lot on entrepreneurship. So let's start by diving straight into the questions. So I know, Mithil, you just mentioned how you've been a part of DECA for 4 years. So talk us through how you kind of got into the club, how you joined, what interested you in joining all those things.
Sure. Um, well, I think the reason I wanted to join DECA is my neighbor, he participated in DECA too, and he's a couple years older than me. It was at a completely different school, but he talked about like everything it taught him, and he even took some projects that he did as part of DECA and he started working on them outside. And he showed me those projects and I thought they were pretty cool. And I decided, who knows, let me try out DECA too. And that's how I joined DECA 4 years ago.
And Neil?
yeah, I think for me, like DECA was kind of something in high school that most people at our school did or were interested in. There's a lot of talk about it. So I kind of just joined out of curiosity to see what it was really. And I kind of fell in love with it and I stuck with it.
All right, that's pretty cool. And what led you guys specifically to doing ETDM? Like, what about the event drew you guys towards it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Neil, you want to take?
Yeah, sure. I think, at least for me personally, I did PBM my freshman year, and I knew I definitely wanted to do a TDM of some sorts when I moved on. And kind of looking at them, ETDM seemed like the one that had a lot of creativity, which I liked, and it kind of translated well from PBM over. So that was kind of how I made that decision.
Yeah, on my side, I actually did not participate in a role player TDM my freshman year. Um, I didn't really see like the value in doing that, but after my first year, I had a couple experiences over my summer that led me to believe that like pitching and whatnot that's involved as part of the ETDM event is actually like really skill based and be important for me to build those skills. And I figured a great way to build those skills was through participating for ETDM.
All right, thank you so much. And I guess kind of looking now away from the past and more into the future. So coming out of DECA, right, being in a business club for 4 years, where do you want to move with your career in the future? Or where do you see yourself? What do you see yourself working as? What do you see yourself doing?
Sure. So I'm actually really interested in tech, the tech world in general. And for those of you who might know, a lot of the tech world runs in like smaller companies. Like there are the big ones like Google, Amazon, Facebook, but like the innovation is usually driven by the smaller companies. And I could definitely see myself in the future wanting to work in that environment. As part of that environment, you have to convince people above you, that you guys are working on something good. That's what entrepreneurship is all about. And like I can definitely see all the practice I've done with, pitching in front of role play judges. You can definitely see me taking those experiences and applying them to the real world where I can, pitch an actual company that might actually be in charge of.
Yeah, I think for me it's very similar. I'm also very interested in tech, and I'm looking at the startup culture. I see myself either starting my own startup or working on someone else's startup, right, closely with them. So I think like this really gave me a sense into not really the technical skill, but more of the soft skills that you need to kind of succeed in the world.
All right, now moving on to some more generic DECA questions. Can you give us some, like, what does your preparation schedule look like before conferences? How do you get ready for NorCal versus ICDC?
Yeah, I think for us, me and Mithil admittedly have not spent too much time really doing role plays that we kind of let happen in the conference itself, because I think we trust ourselves to be able to speak on the spot. For us, mostly the focus has been on test prep, and we've spent a lot of time really perfecting our test prep, doing a lot of practice tests, and really making sure that we're solid on that end. And what we found is that by studying for these tests, we also study for the PIs for the role play part. So it kind of works hand in hand.
Yeah, I guess along the same lines, the role play PI is like really coordinated to the questions. Like, for example, some questions might be like looking into like balance sheets or income statements, and then you could have a role play where your whole task is to create a balance sheet. So what we like try to focus on is like focusing on those underlying skills, and we know that we have the soft skills, we have the creativity needed to actually perform during the role play, and then all we focus on is the content before it.
Okay. And moving forward, at least in entrepreneurship events, what do you think is the biggest way that you can stand out? Like, especially in role play or team decision-making events with so many people talking about the exact same topic.
I guess I would say is enthusiasm. Like, um, especially at the international level, there's so many people who are all so creative. Like they can all come up with, completely out of the box, like situation scenarios to put their judge in. But if you sound boring to the judge, they're gonna forget about you after those 15 minutes. So one thing that Neil and I really try to focus on is like emphasizing certain things, or like being more flashy with what we do. For example, like not being afraid to throw something across the table just to make an impact to the judge, or like will actually remember after the 15 minutes.
Yeah, I think kind of adding on to what Mithil started to say at the end, we try to not only answer all the PIs, but also have one where we're really strong, where we have something planned that's going to set us apart. And that's what we kind of like focus on as something that the judge remembers us by.
All right, going more into kind of what you talked about earlier for the exam and like also the case studies that you get on your test, or sorry, on your role play. How do you study for the exam specifically? Like, does that look like Quizlet? Does that look like using other platforms? Run us through that.
Yeah, so I can speak to that. At least this year, what we did is just a bunch of practice tests, and we'll push each other to see like who can get the best score on practice tests. There's like tons of practice tests out there. You just have to search, and once we like do those practice tests, we go back, we grade it, and we see which questions we got wrong. And I think one thing importantly is that we don't like do it one question at a time and then go back and like grade one question at a time. We do the whole thing at once. And I think a lot of people underestimate like the time of the DECA test. Like really it's only 100 questions and you can finish it pretty quickly, but by the end you start to get at least a little bit fatigued. And by doing the entire thing at once and then grading it after we finish all 100 questions, it really helps us. And then what we do is for all the questions that we got wrong, we just go look up the underlying concept in there, because that's probably like a concept that we might have a weak spot on.
Yeah, and I think one more thing that I think was really helpful is when we're doing these practices, we have our tests are always shared with each other. So it kind of helps us stay accountable and make sure that like one of us isn't slacking off, because we can see what the other person's doing and kind of, make sure that we're both on the same page.
Yeah, and I'd add one more thing to that is that I can also learn from Neil's mistakes. For example, there might have been a question where, I might have guessed and somehow got the correct answer. Versus Neil, he might have guessed also because he didn't know the concept, and then he might have gotten the wrong answer. And when we go back and we check all the questions we got wrong, I might have said, "Oh, I got it correct. I must know the concept." But Neil, he would have said, "Oh, I got it wrong," and then he would have written a little note to himself and myself about what the actual concept is, so that I can study it too and cite him.
Well, thanks for that tip. So now let's talk more about the role play portion. So specifically, let's focus on the prep period, right? We get 30 minutes. Give us your breakdown of what it might look like and how you're getting ready for your actual 10-minute or 15 minutes.
Yeah, I think the first 5 minutes for us is kind of the most involved, I guess you could say, because that's, we try to read it and kind of come up with a general plan of what we're going to do. And another thing me and Little do is we don't specifically make notes for ourselves. We do more of like a slide deck, right? So basically we kind of come up with a plan, and then each of us makes some slides, or we'll assign each other slides and kind of work through those next 25 minutes. And this kind of allows us to not have to waste too much time on memorizing what we're going to say or trying to remember, because as we're kind of making the slides, we're thinking about that, and then you kind of can just improv it once you're there because you have the slide to fall back on, and that kind of works as both the visual and notes. But yeah, so it's about 5 minutes of kind of discussion, and then we're usually just working through the back end.
Yeah, and then to add on top of that, and it works really well because whatever slides that Neil makes, like whatever topics that he covers and writes down on paper, he'll be the one talking about those. And even if he might write like half of what he's going to say, he knows what he's going to say. So even because if you were to just put, like 100 words on a piece of paper and show that to the judge isn't going to understand anything. Or they might understand it, but they're not going to take it away. But if he puts like a little bit and then he talks a lot and he explains through everything that little bit represents, that's what really works for us.
All right, now you started to go into this towards the end of that, but how do you split up speaking time allocation in the role play?
Yeah, so really we kind of let it go naturally, and just, as we get ideas, we start claiming slides, and usually it's about a 50-50 split. And sometimes maybe if we feel like one person has too many slides and we have a little bit of time at the end, the other person will kind of go through and be like, hey, I can take over this slide. That way we're more even. But most of the time it's just kind of a natural split.
Yeah, and going back to like the first 5 minutes, another thing that we do is like we make a little table of contents slide, like, and we just plan out, okay, here's every single slide we're going to need, and then we can also divide up tasks. And again, as Neil said, that's kind of natural. Like Neil will say, oh, I have a great idea for this, let me do this slide, and I'll say, okay, sure, and then I'll say, oh, I have a good idea for this one, I'll do this slide.
Okay. Now, kind of, after each role play or at the end of each conference, you'll get the feedback sheet with stuff from your judges or your mentors, even if you're at mock cons or whatever. So how do you guys kind of work with that feedback? How are you handling the feedback, and how are you using it to improve?
Yeah, so a lot of times the feedback for us is generally around like speaking skills. Like we tend to do a pretty good job of getting through every single PI and every single like little bullet point of the PIs. And they might say something like, oh, I wish you would have spent, 1 or 2 more minutes on this topic, 1 or 2 more minutes on this topic. And that helps us get a better sense of like the judges are not just the people in our head. The judges are real people, and they understand different things differently than the way we understand things. And I think that's what the feedback helps with the most. It's understanding that judges have certain weak points, and we have to cater to those weak points so that we do better.
Yeah, and another thing I do is like the day before a competition or something, I'll just go through all the feedback I've gotten on role plays. That way I just kind of have a mental note in the back of my head that, hey, these are the things that I'm messing up on, just so like I remember and I'm conscious of those things while I'm doing the role play.
All right, sounds good. And entrepreneurship often involves sort of adapting to unforeseen challenges. Can you share a time where you had to change your approach during, like, maybe in the middle of a role play, or like building off of each other? Like, how do you adapt and how are you flexible within your role play?
I think that adaptability really comes for us in the question section. We have a pretty clear like mindset of what we want to do going into going into the actual presentation of the TDM, because we have 30 minutes to like prepare for the 15-minute presentation, and in those 30 minutes we usually have a little bit of time at the end to go over everything we're going to say. So there's usually no conflicts in what we're saying, and we don't have to change on the spot there. But during the questions, a lot of times we do have to change. And that's always like off the top, right? We don't have anything prepared, we don't have any notes. But one thing we try to do is not just come up with something that's like outlandish. Like if a judge asks us a question like, how are you going to market XYZ product? We're not going to, you know, propose a solution that's disconnected to everything we've already talked about. We're going to try to connect it back. And when we connect it back, they can remember everything cohesively.
And I think another thing is one of the benefits of us going kind of like the slides route is nothing's ever scripted, right? We have our slides, but really we can say whatever we need to say. So if I feel like, I didn't touch on a topic as much as I wanted on a slide, I can start thinking, okay, how can I bring this back in? Maybe add a little bit of this when I get back to my next slide, right? How can I implement into questions? Because nothing's ever really scripted. Like I don't think Mithil and I have ever like specifically scripted out anything or thought like, okay, we have to say this on a slide. So it's a lot more free flowing, and kind of as the presentation goes, you can see about if I need to add something in, take something out of that.
Okay. And now kind of shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to kind of ask a question around this idea of entrepreneurship, right? So entrepreneurship itself revolves around that idea of like adapting to unforeseen challenges. So can you guys maybe elaborate on a time where maybe in DECA conference, maybe not, where you guys have had to kind of, come up to a roadblock and find a way around it, or come up with a different solution to solve some problem that you had?
Yeah, so I guess an example of where that comes up pretty frequently for us is, DECA isn't the only competitions we're part of. There's a lot of other competitions out there, and some of them are like impromptu speaking. Some of them are like question, like you pitch something and then you get questions based on that. And again, the adaptability that's like such an integral part of entrepreneurship is really important when you get those questions from other people. And I guess another example that I could give you is interviews. Like not only during an interview do you have to be able to adapt to all the questions that are thrown at you, but another big thing about interviews is that you have to like sell yourself. And I think that's one of the most important things about entrepreneurship and really what differentiates entrepreneurship from marketing and selling. Because in marketing and selling, you're only selling the product versus in entrepreneurship, you're selling yourself too. You're saying that not only is our business good, but I am also good enough to go and implement and turn this business into like $1 million business. And if you're interviewing for a job, if you're interviewing for like college applications or a summer program, that can help a lot. You can excel yourself and say like, I can help you with this job, or I can help you at this college, and I can bring something no one else can.
Yeah, I think Mithil kind of got most of that, but really like when dealing with like questions and stuff, right? All of entrepreneurship, you can't know everything beforehand, right? You're always thinking on your feet. You can't go in with a set mindset, right? You have to always be ready to kind of adapt to what other people think, sell different points, right, that you might not have thought of. So it's really a lot of not being too stubborn to what your initial idea was and being willing to change on the fly, I think is the biggest thing.
Right. So looking back, what would you do differently in your DECA competitions or in your like entrepreneurial journey overall?
One thing that I would definitely do is in freshman year, I'd definitely try out some other role plays. I tried out ETDM and I really liked it, but I feel now that in my freshman year, because I didn't do any role plays, I might have missed out on trying some other ones. Maybe there's one out there that I like better.
Yeah, I think also one of the things is like not having confidence in myself. I think my freshman and even to some extent the beginning of my sophomore year, I kind of didn't put as much effort in as I probably could have because I didn't think that, I was in a position where I could actually win. And I think maybe if I'd started putting in more effort then, not only would I maybe had success then, but it would have been a lot easier down the road if I just stuck with it from the start.
Okay. And as we start wrapping up, I kind of want to do a recap of just this past year. So thinking back to, districts, states, ICDC, when you guys were competing in your event, what would you guys say was, you know, the biggest thing in each of those role plays you did that really made you stand out? You mentioned enthusiasm earlier, and I guess that was kind of a general tip, but in those specific instances, each with, different kinds of role plays, different, I would say like levels, what do you think really made you stand out?
I think I have a good one for our ICDC role play. In the final round, actually, we had a mistake where we had the wrong order of slides, and I think Mythil came up with a really good idea where he kind of played it off as like the PowerPoint glitch, right? And it was something where not only one did we get ourselves out of obviously a bad situation, but it made our presentation seem a lot more human, right? Not as robotic. And I think that kind of maybe stuck with the judge as something that was unique because we were being able to react to the mistake and kind of play it off well. And I think that really worked well.
And I could add another example too. I think this was at ICDC. I don't remember if it was in the finals round or the original round, but I remember there was like a really important part about pitching is like telling a story, right? You have to like tell the story about the business, how the business has grown, and how it can grow in the future. And I think the role play, the case study that we're doing is about it had some relation to pivoting, right? Like we have to like typically this is what other companies do. We're going to try and do something else. So we talked like for a good minute about like one thing, and then I remember Neil. He just grabbed the paper and he tore it apart. He's like, "We don't do that here." And I think that's like the creativity, the emphasis. And this was like almost in the middle, like 7, 8 minutes into our presentation when the judge is starting to almost go to sleep, and this kind of wakes them back up. Is like, "Whoa, did a kid just tear a piece of paper in front of me in a professional setting?" And I think that worked for us really well.
All right, so for wrapping it up, what advice would you give to students or aspiring entrepreneurs looking to succeed in DECA and beyond?
I think the number one thing is just be confident and back yourself. Right. I go into competitions, not just deck of anything, thinking like if you don't believe that you are the best in that room and that you can win, you're not going to be able to do it. Right. You have to truly believe that you're capable of doing something, and that'll take you further than any prep you could do.
Yeah, and I guess that goes for beyond DECA. Like if there's a position that you're interested in, if there's a job position that you're interested in, a summer program that you're interested in, like don't be afraid to go after that. Like you should walk into whatever the essays you have to write or a video presentation you have to make or interview you have to do. You should walk in like I deserve this position, because if you don't walk in like that, they won't believe you either.
Okay. And that wraps it up for the questions we have for you guys today. But before we end, we want to open the floor to any questions that anyone who is watching might have. So if you want to unmute, ask them, drop them in the chat, or PM them to LRI, we can go ahead and ask them. Okay. So I got one right now. It's in reference to your ICDC final role play. They were asking, like, when that mess up happened with the slides you were mentioning, what was the way that what advice would you give for someone to be able to overcome that fear or maybe that like anxiousness that comes after you make that mistake?
Yeah, one thing would be confidence, as we just mentioned. Like if you know that you know your stuff, then you can just like believe that even if I made that mistake, I'm still gonna win. Like even if the slides were in order, I still have a good shot of you know putting a smile on the face of the judge. And like once you do that, like you can really do anything.
Yeah, I think Method kind of touched on this, but I don't think that if we hadn't, come up with the PowerPoint glitching idea, we would have lost, right? I don't think one mistake can really make or break your presentation, right? The judge might have never remembered it. They'd have just like, okay, they swapped the slides back, continued on. So it kind of just you can't worry about it too much if the mistake's already made, right? If you can think of something creative, play it off, that's fine. If not, the best thing to do is just move on, right? It's in the past, focus on the rest of the presentation, and hopefully it's not too big of a deal and you'll be fine.
All right, and we have another question. What advice would you give for picking the best events?
I think definitely do something you're interested in, right? I see a lot of people ask me like, hey, what's the easiest event to qualify it? Or what's the event that requires the least work? And the answer is it's always going to be the event that you're the most interested in and that the one that you know the most about. Because a lot of things that be pull are from background information that we know, things we've read about, right? It has to be something you're interested in because then you'll already have that background information. You're not going to be specifically researching it, and it'll become a lot easier for you if you already have that background information.
Yeah, kind of adding on that, like you really have to like understand the field you're doing. Like for entrepreneurship, a lot of the things that are being asked are about, markets in general, or what do customers want. Like sometimes there's even a little bit of economics. Like this is what the market is, and the market is shrinking, the market is growing. And you should be able to understand like supply and demand, and that's something me and Neil like have been interested in for quite a while. So when there's a question that comes up, we're able to, oh, I remember there's like this graph we learned in econ, and I can put it on the slides.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you guys so much for joining. It was a pleasure to have you, Mithil and Neil, and thank you everyone else who came and watched.